So Carlota, I want to thank you first for taking the time to meet with me and give me this interview. I really appreciate this. I know you're very, very busy and we're right next to the holiday season. So thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I love talking to you. So this is just perfect for me.
Great, great. I want to be able to introduce you to some of my readers that don't know yet what it is that you do. You are a vCISO, a virtual CISO. So can you explain for us exactly what that is and what that entails? What does that mean? What does a vCISO
Absolutely.
do?
Absolutely. So let's start with what a CISO is. A CISO, Chief Information Security Officer for an enterprise organization or a large business. That's the person who sets your cybersecurity and compliance strategy and builds your cybersecurity and compliance teams. What we find is that companies often need that strategy long before they're able to hire their first full-time CISO. So that's where a virtual CISO service like Pocket CISO comes into play. You get the benefit of my knowledge for a fraction of the price. So all of the templates that I would use to create policy, any questions that you would have that will help head off problems later. I become much like a lawyer on retainer. I become a source for you to ask questions of and start setting that strategy much, much sooner than if you were hiring a full-time CISO.
That really sounds like that would be super beneficial.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. You bring up this point that often there's the need for this
Mm-hmm.
work
Mm-hmm.
before they ever get to the point where they're actually beginning to hire somebody. Can you
Exactly.
expand on that just a little bit? And you mentioned templates. Can you expand on that just a little
Sure.
bit more?
Well, and what I find, so I'm gonna frame this in terms of organizational size, right? So it doesn't matter if my clients have been e-commerce, software startups, fintech, nonprofits. Really, what we see is that the size impacts what they need. So a 500-person organization or a 1,000-person organization, they're starting to build out those teams. But even when you're a 5-person organization, you need things that they're in some ways basic business or good business practice, but they really impact your cybersecurity and compliance over time. So simple things like a business continuity document, right? A disaster recovery document, an acceptable use policy in terms of how people connect to the tools that you use, how they use your software and hardware. All of those things are very simple to create at for a very small organization, and they're hugely impactful, especially in terms of compliance as that organization grows. So if you're in fintech, for example, or you're serving folks who are looking for you to have that good security hygiene, they'll say, or just a basic security program, or they're looking for SOC 2 compliance or some other sort of compliance, you're going to want to have some of those basic documents. That what happens is that when I get a 300-person organization that doesn't have those documents, it's a lot of cleanup.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Start early and it's
Yes.
simple. Wait
Yes.
and it gets more complicated. I like that.
Exactly. Exactly. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is I had been focused on that 150 to 500 person organization. I'm trying to move further down market and grab those companies when they're 5 and 10 person organizations and set them up to prevent the problems that I was solving for those 3 to 500 person organizations. And I'm trying to bring that price point way down. Um, to engage my former consulting company that I worked with would have been an $80 to $150,000 engagement, and that means that you need to be making a certain level of revenue. But if I can bring that price point down to 15,000 or 5,000 a year and give you the insight that you need without a lot of hands-on high touch work, then I'm saving you a lot of money over time, and I'm also setting you up for success better. And that means that as you grow to that larger company that needs more hands-on work or needs more of my time, I can keep that price point lower, and it's just a lot less work for all of us.
Wow, that really sounds like you've put a lot of thought and
Mhm.
effort into how to
Mhm.
make this reasonable for smaller
Mhm.
companies to start out and for how they can easily get started.
Right.
So a lot of the clients that I serve are
Mhm.
startups. They may
Exactly.
get substantial funding and they may grow quite quickly,
Mhm.
but they're startups. So they're going to be
Mhm.
exactly in this kind of small business,
Mhm.
like you just described.
Mhm.
So let me ask you something
Sure.
else. You mentioned a couple of things, and I want to
Mhm.
kind of pull out something and
Mhm.
separate it. You mentioned some compliance stuff and some policies and
Mhm.
procedures, and then you also mentioned cybersecurity. Which
Right.
of these do you think these kinds of businesses, these small businesses need to focus on first? Do they need to focus on compliance first, or is it the cybersecurity best practices first?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think cybersecurity best practices, and for a very small organization, it comes down to how a lot of vendor management. What are the platforms that you're using, and what cybersecurity behaviors do they enable or support? And just configuring, for example, your Microsoft 365 or your Google Workspace area, configuring that correctly can save you a lot of headache in the long run. Um, in terms of compliance, what I often see for startups, because nobody's going into a startup thinking they're going to fail, right?
Right.
Their idea is that I'm going to grow and become an enterprise organization, or at least a larger organization, or I'm going to IPO, or I'm going to be purchased, right? So those are kind of the three ideal outcomes for a startup. And in all of those cases, especially for example, the pre-IPO, compliance does come into play because once you become a publicly traded company, you're subject to what's called Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a financial audit. So what I see is a lot of startups will start doing that Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX style audit before they IPO to make sure that they've got kind of their ducks in a row. And where they trip the most often is missing those basic policy and procedures around information security. Again, that acceptable use policy, your vendor management policy, your risk register. Have you done a risk assessment? Do you know where cybersecurity and risk intersect in your business? So a lot of those things that feel overwhelming if you don't have them in place are actually very simple if you start early.
Well, that sounds like a
Yeah.
relief. And let me ask you just for clarification.
Mhm.
So if you are a vCISO working with an organization and they think, oh, it's time for us to start getting ready for our, SOC assessment, are
Mhm.
you able to help them in the preparation of that as well?
Absolutely. I can help
Uh,
them. Security is not compliance, compliance is not security, but you can build, if you have both of these things in mind, you can build a solid security program that supports your compliance framework. And there's no reason to make it more complicated than it needs to be. Starting with compliance, what we find with compliance, it's often a sales enablement concept for most of the smaller organizations. They have bigger companies that they're trying to sell into, and those bigger companies are asking for compliance because they don't have a good way of assessing your security program, right? So a lot of what we see is that you start with compliance, and you end up realizing just kind of how short you are on the security front, and it becomes it becomes a little bit of a dicing. Do I want to check the boxes, or do I want to actually protect my business?
So it also sounds like in this role as a vCISO that you have to be also very flexible because, as you just described, it might
Right.
almost change every
Right.
day
Right.
of
Right.
what they're doing and where they're going, especially when they're growing very quickly.
Exactly.
Is there a success story that you could share with us of, let's say, a small business that you were able to
Sure.
help and what that looked like for them?
Even a very small business, one of my clients, for example, their cyber insurance, they couldn't get cyber insurance. And they couldn't do it because they were filling out this broker questionnaire, and they were basically saying, we have no security, which was before they started with me, true, right? Did a gap assessment, did a risk assessment, did some of the basics, and within a matter of months, I was able to fill in that brokerage questionnaire and get them that cybersecurity very quickly. Same thing on the audit front, the compliance side takes a little bit longer, but I actually had a cybersecurity startup come to me and say, hey, we're great at security. We don't know what we're doing with compliance. Can we get to compliance within a year? And the answer is absolutely yes. I think a year is actually a very reasonable timeline for, I think that was a 60-person organization. So we were able to get them to their compliance because as a security startup, right, they're held to that higher standard, and they are selling to companies that really do want to see that security and compliance programs.
Excellent. And I just want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
I know we talked about a lot of things, but
Mhm.
when a company comes to you in the beginning,
Mhm.
are
Mhm.
there 1, 2, or maybe 3 key areas that you tell the executives, look, these are areas that you really need to focus on, kind of high priority? Do you have like maybe a list like that you could share with us?
Oh boy, I have like a top 6 list basically, and I'm
Okay,
not going to go
6.
through all of it, but yeah, it's out there. It's on my website. It's out there in different forms. But the biggest thing is just good basic security. On the good basic security side, get a password manager, roll it out to folks. Turn multi-factor authentication on in all of the places, all of the programs that you're using that support it. Those 2 things alone will prevent over 80% of malware, just having good passwords that are managed correctly and having multi-factor authentication on. So that's on the security side. On the compliance side, a lot of what you're doing has a small organization. Maybe you're not ready for a SOC 2 audit yet. In that gap, while you're waiting or building out your compliance and security program, go to the Vendor Security Alliance, vendorsecurityalliance.org, and they have free questionnaires, free security questionnaires. So instead of you filling out every security questionnaire that every different potential prospect is sending you, reach back out to them and say, hey, could I share my Vendor Security Alliance questionnaire with you instead? Most reasonable CISOs or security directors will accept that, and it saves you a lot of time as a business owner or sales team. So those are my 2 biggest pieces of advice. And there's tons of free advice that I'm happy to give. If you just don't know where to start simple. Start with good passwords and multi-factor authentication.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Just starting with the small
Mm-hmm.
pieces and the fact that you have these other resources that are out there that can save them so much time and money. I love the focus on saving time, money, and effort. I love
Yes.
that. Yes, super, super important.
Exactly.
So I also want to ask you, give us
Sure.
again your URL to your website where people can go and see your website. I've seen it and I think it's very cute. I love it. And I love the name. I love all of that. So go ahead and give it to us again.
Thank you. Thank you. I am the founder of Pocket CISO, POCKET-CISO.com. So you can find me there. You can follow me on LinkedIn, and I will be happy to answer all of your questions.
Awesome. Great. And I'll include all of that information in the article that I'm going to produce. And was there anything else you wanted to share with us before we wrap up?
I think that's everything I've got for you today. Just passwords, multi-factor, all the things, and just go and be very cognizant of what you're doing online.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thank you. And I hope that we can do this again because I think you have some really useful information to share, and I think people will really appreciate that. Thank you so much again for your time.
Thanks, Charlene.
Thanks, Carlota.